Hello, everybody. This lecture is going to be on the Great Depression, but it's going to be more focusing on the two presidents that we had during the Great Depression and how they responded to it. So, the Great Depression occurred from 1929 to 1939. We still had economic issues after 1939. It's not like everything was solved in 1939, but that is the year that World War II started. And so our focus gets shifted in 1939. There are actually elements of World War II that helped our economy. But regardless, when we study US history and we're kind of putting things in time brackets, the Great Depression did occur in 1929 to 1939. So I know you already did assignments on this, but if you want to have just a quick summary in your notes, you can go ahead and write this down. If you feel like you already know this information, then don't write it down. But here's just a quick snapshot of how the Great Depression affected Americans. You guys know that people lost money overnight. If you had money in your banking account and if your bank closed or failed, there was no security, there was no support. You legitimately lost that money overnight. So obviously that's going to hit people of all different economic statuses. It's going to hit the rich people that had their money in banks. It's going to hit the middle class and the lower class. You guys know because of supply and demand, if people are losing their money, that means that they're making less products, which means that the businesses have to accommodate for that, and people started losing their jobs. So unemployment is incredibly high. Many people lost their homes due to foreclosures, and they are living in something called shanty towns. You can actually see that in the image on the top left. A shanty town is kind of like a shack, basically. If you've ever been to Skid Row in Los Angeles, it's kind of central downtown Los Angeles. You see a lot of homeless people living on the streets. That's a modern day shanty town. The thing here, though, is that these people, a lot of these people in the Great Depression, they owned homes. They had a home. They just couldn't meet their payment. There was no support or security. Therefore, they had to foreclose their home. And so they end up with, again, living in shacks, nicknamed shanty towns. People hoped to get a warm meal at a soup kitchen. And this is again coming from a charity or a church. So you can see in the picture on the bottom right, it says free soup, coffee, and donuts for the unemployed. So again, the government's not providing free food for people. The government's not doing any handouts, but charities and churches are finding ways to practically support people in this time of need. So soup kitchens were a popular spot for people just to get a warm meal, because that's how desperate and that's how tough times are right now. Suicide and depression, of course, are increasing because of just the hardships that people are having. I just think that this woman right here in the top right, I think she just perfectly depicts just the emotion of the time period, the feeling of the time period, how this is affecting women specifically, but all how this is affecting families. And so suicide and depression are increasing at dramatic amounts. Children, of course, are suffering in a multitude of ways. They're not going to school like normal. They're not even finding jobs like normal. And they are suffering from malnutrition as well. So, people having lack of good nutrients is obviously affecting all families. So, ladies and gentlemen, again, when you see the word depression, you might think just the emotional, mental health part, but depression means to go down. And in regards to this, we're talking about our economy. And when our economy crashed and went down this low, it definitely affected people in a multitude of ways. So, the Great Depression, one of the hardest moments that our country has been in. How are we going to respond? The first president that we had in the Great Depression was named Herbert Hoover. I'm probably going to mistake saying his name a multitude of times, so just give me some grace. I always want to say Sherbert, but it's Herbert. Herbert Hoover. He is our president from 1929 to 1933. Poor timing. I mean, he didn't know. There's nothing that he did that caused the Great Depression to happen. But in 1929, he becomes president, and then the Great Depression happens. Now, Herbert Hoover actually has kind of a legacy with how he didn't fix the Great Depression. But I give him a lot of slack because our country had never experienced something like the Great Depression before. And so, of course, he didn't know how to solve it because we had never had this situation happen. So, Herbert Hoover is going to try some things. And yeah, they're not going to work, but his legacy went down as being someone who didn't know how to solve the Great Depression. Well, I think a lot of us wouldn't know how to solve the Great Depression. So let's give him some slack. He's kind of like Abraham Lincoln a little bit to me, where Abraham Lincoln became president and then the Civil War happened. People blame the whole Civil War on just Abraham Lincoln. And I'm like, no, slavery caused the Civil War. Lincoln just unfortunately was the president right when it happened. So, Herbert Hoover, let's look at how he responded. Let's give him some grace. But we also will look at what he did well and what he did that ended up failing. So, Herbert Hoover, 1929 to 1933. So, of course, a president is not just making decisions by themselves. Herbert Hoover is surrounded by people that are giving him advice. You know that he has his presidential cabinet, he has the other leaders in his federal agencies. And so when the Great Depression happened, he turned to his experts, his economic advisors. And so those advisors told him to do nothing. I know, before you just start freaking out, like, do nothing, this is actually an economic theory. With capitalism, people, and again, economic experts have analyzed capitalism over time, and they've noticed that it naturally goes up and down. Businesses thrive, businesses go bankrupt. People thrive, people go bankrupt. There are times where the economy is doing well, and there are times when the economy is not doing well. In a capitalist society where people are heavily involved in the economy, it's going to naturally go up and down and up and down. And it might stay up for a while, it might stay down for a while. But some economic experts say you let the economy fix itself. It will bounce back, people will find jobs, people will buy things, and things will get back on track. If the government were to intervene too much, it might make the problem worse. If the government tried to take over, that could be communism, and that could make things worse. So when Herbert Hoover experienced the Great Depression and all the things that have happened, he turned to his advisors and they said, do nothing. Let's see how the economy fixes itself. Hoover did want the government to help in some ways, and so he did ask businesses to not cut wages. He also asked them to not lay off a lot of people. But the only way a business was able to survive the Great Depression is if they cut wages and if they laid people off. So, if they kept paying people the same and they kept the same amount of people, then of course businesses just went bankrupt and collapsed. So something that he thought was going to help people ended up hurting a lot of people. Now keep in mind, in Herbert Hoover's presidency, there are no federal handouts. There's nothing called direct relief. Direct relief is kind of in the name. It is directly like giving you some sort of support. So think about the COVID stimulus checks. Many people in America are unemployed right now. Many people are suffering economically right now. So they turn to the government and they're asking for direct relief, direct support. And the government is saying, okay, we are giving you this amount of money in direct relief. They hope that it will help those people And the reason it's called a stimulus check is because they're hoping that that money will go back into the American economy and help someone else, and therefore stimulating the American economy of people buying and selling things. And so, again, if you get your stimulus check and you use it to buy groceries, you then are feeding into the grocery market people, like their salaries, you're helping them out, and the farmers and all the products of all the companies that are able to sell their products because now you just bought them. So again, this is direct relief. People need money right now in the pandemic, and the government is approving certain amounts. None of that is happening right now in the Great Depression. Okay? So everything I just said, none of that is happening in the Great Depression. There are no checks, there's no money support, there's no food support, there is no housing support, there are no federal handouts. The idea here is rugged individualism. The idea that in the American spirit, in the American core, you pull up by your bootstraps and you get it done. You don't have a job? Go find a job. That's how the Americans do it. We are rugged. We are individualist. We don't depend on the government. We don't need their help. We can do it on our own. However, that may work, in normal circumstances, but in the Great Depression, this was met with a lot of criticism. Here's something else that Hoover tried, but ended up failing. In 1930, he passed the Hawley-Smoot Tariff. A tariff is a tax on international goods. So basically, he's increasing the tax on foreign countries who are trying to sell stuff in America. He raised the average tariff rates to nearly 60%. So he's trying to make a lot of money off of other countries who are trying to sell things in America. This, of course, caused our international trading partners to be really mad at us. So they retaliated by raising the rates on our US made goods. So we tried to benefit and tax them heavy for selling goods in America. They got mad and taxed our goods more too, the goods that we are making and we're trying to sell in their country. So the result was a shrinking international trade, so less countries wanted to trade with us, and a further decline in global economies. When America goes through the Great Depression, it's going to affect every country that we trade with. So even before this tariff business happens, it was already affecting other countries, but this tariff just made things even worse. So again, maybe a good idea at first, but definitely ended up failing. One success that Hoover had was creating the Boulder Dam. It was later called the Hoover Dam, obviously after Herbert Hoover. It is a dam for the Colorado River, and it provided electricity, flood control, and regulated the water supply. But the best benefit is that a lot of people, had to build this dam. So this Boulder Dam project created a lot of jobs for people that wanted some income. The government needed it built, and so they signed up for the job. So that's a good success for people getting jobs in the Great Depression. 1932, he signed the Federal Home Loan Bank Act. It lowered mortgage rates for homeowners and refinanced farm loans for people. And all of this was to avoid foreclosures. So this one's a really good success, and it's going to be, it's something that Hoover did that was well. He saw that people were losing their homes and that they were in threat of losing their farms. So if people cannot meet their mortgage rates, let's support them and try to lower it. Let's give people the opportunity to refinance their loans. If they can't make their loan payment, maybe we can give them some grace and lower the amount. So they might have to have the loan for longer, but they can pay it in smaller amounts. Again, this is to avoid people having to lose their farm or losing their homes. In 1932, Reconstruction Finance Corporation was also created. This gave $2 billion, yes, that is not a typo, $2 billion for emergency financing of banks, life insurance companies, railroads, and other large businesses. Now, pause there. Do you see where the money's going? This is a bunch of money going to large businesses. The idea here is if we support and if we help these large businesses stay in business, then of course they have a bunch of employees, so they would still have a job. And eventually the money would trickle down to all the common people. If we help these big companies on top, then maybe it'll help the whole of our country, and that idea that money will trickle down to the common people. This one received a lot of criticism during the time because what it looked like is that the government was giving a bunch of money to a bunch of rich people and rich companies. So they helped the rich people, they helped the upper middle class, but the actual poor people that are suffering the worst during the Great Depression, the money's not trickling down to them. Okay, you saved a railroad company. I don't have food. How does that work? You know what I mean? So there was frustration. Apparently the government does have money and can help people, but they're choosing to help large businesses. Now you got to know the pros and cons. You got to know what the thought process was behind it. The idea was keep these big businesses open with a bunch of employees. They all have jobs. Awesome. But it did not help the common, average, everyday person during the Great Depression. Okay, this is the last topic for Herbert Hoover. This is actually an incident that occurred towards the end of his presidency. There was a group of people called the Bonus Army. Bonus Army. Oops, sorry. Let me just pause my video real quick. Sorry about that, guys. Hold on. Okay, sorry about that. So this is the last incident, and it's a group of people called the Bonus Army, and it's actually a group of veterans. So they go to Washington, D.C., and they're trying to show their support for something called the Patman Bill. This would pay a bonus to World War I veterans who had not been paid adequately for their wartime service. So again, they're showing their support for the Patman Bill. They think that they weren't paid well for their World War I service, so they want a bonus, hence the name Bonus Army. Look at the picture on the right. We need cash, not a tombstone. Pay the bonus now. However, President Hoover opposed this bill, and the Senate also voted it down. So again, the Bonus Army is at Washington, D.C. They're trying to say, pass this bill, and Hoover and the Senate are not. Hoover orders the bonus marchers to disband, to go away, and most of them do. However, 2,000 of them stay to speak with the president, aka they're protesting. Hoover then sent armed forces to disband the remainder of the group. The infantry gassed more than 1,000 people, unfortunately killing an 11-month-old baby who was in the crowd and blinding an 8-year-old boy. So what the heck is happening here? Again, Hoover is a president. He's a person. He has to make a lot of decisions. We're in the Great Depression. We have this group of veterans. They want their pay for their service in World War I. The Patman Bill, got voted down. They're protesting, and it goes south. It goes violent. The armed forces doesn't look good. Hoover doesn't look good. You just gassed a bunch of veterans that just fought in World War I, and you're injuring people. You killed a baby. It's just not looking great. So people already have criticism for how he dealt with the Great Depression, but now, even with this, it just leaves a bad taste in people's mouths. So, we get a new president. Now, you better know this person's name. Make sure you remember it. And it's not Teddy Roosevelt. It's not Theodore Roosevelt. You need to know this Roosevelt. FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. You can say Delano if you want. There's always kids that do, but they usually say Delano. Franklin Roosevelt gets elected in 1933. So the Great Depression has been happening for 4 years now. Keep in mind, we are just coming up to celebrating the year of the pandemic hitting us. Think about how hard this year has been. And people have been suffering the Great Depression for 4 very long years. But FDR gives them a beacon of hope. FDR is going to be a very well-liked president, not liked by all, okay? Every president has their critic, but he is going to be a very liked president, and the data that I have to support that is because he gets reelected 4 times. Yes, you heard me, that was not a typo, 4 times. He is our president throughout the Great Depression. He is our president throughout World War II. People liked his leadership, people trusted his leadership, and they elected him 4 times. He unfortunately died during his 4th term, but if he would have lived throughout his whole term, he would have been our president for 16 years. Yeah. So when I say people liked him, they must have liked him enough to re-elect him that many times. So, why is he getting elected right now? Why is he the beacon of hope during the Great Depression? He promises the people a new deal. The idea here is like a new plan. He wanted to act quickly to try and solve the problems of the Great Depression. If Herbert Hoover's advisors told him, hey, let the economy fix itself, don't do much, well, 4 years have passed and it's getting worse. And so what FDR is going to try to do is like, okay, well, doing nothing didn't work, so let me just do a lot of stuff. He is going to create a series of government programs, laws, work projects. He's honestly going to try anything and everything. Yeah, he's going to create a program, see if it works. If it does, keep it. He's going to create a program. Oh, that one didn't work, and delete it. He is going to create so many government programs, so many government laws, so many work projects. It's almost going to be overwhelming for you. But keep in mind, the people just wanted a president who's going to do something, who's going to try to help. And some of these programs, guys, they're amazing. They helped a lot of people, and they still help people today. Some of these programs, terrible. Wasted a bunch of money. They just did not work. Some of these programs are terrible. So you'll see that later on in the presentation. Some of these are good, some of these aren't. But the idea here is that FDR is trying. He's trying to fix the Great Depression. So what is his plan? It's called the New Deal. The New Deal. And there's 3 R's that you need to know. In all of the programs that he's going to make, there's going to be a combination of maybe 1 or 2 of these R's. The first R is relief. It is immediate assistance for the needy. So some of these programs are just going to immediately give people help. Think about when you have a really bad headache and you just want relief. Some of these people are literally starving to death. So they really need immediate relief. They need food. They need money. They need a job. They need a home. So some of these programs are immediately going to give relief to the poor. Some of these programs are going to be recovery. What this means is that our economy is so low, it needs stimulus. It needs a kickstart. It needs that beep, like the thing. I don't know. You can't see me, but I'm trying to do that thing with my hands, where the chest thingy. I don't know. Our economy needs that. And so some of these programs are going to be designed to be temporary. They're only supposed to exist for a year or 2, and they're supposed to kickstart and give some life back to our economy. So they're usually going to be dealt with businesses or banks or something like that. Again, temporary fix to hopefully kickstart the economy. And last but certainly not least, the most important for you and me, reform. When you reform something, it means you change it. So there are going to be some programs that are permanent changes to make sure that this never happens again. Permanent financial changes to make sure that this never happens again. For example, my favorite one. I have money in the bank. I got that money in that bank, okay? I no longer have to go to sleep at night and think, tomorrow all my money might be gone. Because I am supported by something called the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. If Wells Fargo went down in flames tomorrow, okay, that's where my bank is. If Wells Fargo went down in flames, the government backs Wells Fargo and backs every depositor, that's me, up to $250,000. Now, guys, I'm going to give you a little secret here. I don't have $250,000 in my bank, but if I did, it would all be protected. So let's just say my money is safe. The government would give me that money if Wells Fargo ever went down in flames. So that's just one example of a reform program that we learned from the Great Depression, and we changed things for our future. Now, shout out to my Parks and Recreation fans. This will only be to a couple of you. You guys know Ron Swanson in Parks and Rec. He doesn't trust the government. He doesn't trust banks. He puts all his money in gold and he buries it in different parts of his house. So if you really don't trust banks and you really don't trust the government, then maybe turn all your money into gold and sleep on it and bury it in different parts of your house. Do the Ron Swanson. So ladies and gentlemen, FDR is going to try everything. How is he affording this, by the way? It's called deficient spending. Some people support this, some people don't. The government's actually going in debt. The government is spending money on programs and projects to help the American people. It's called deficient spending, meaning you're using money that you don't technically have. But it is an idea that you can lose this temporary money, help out your country's economy, and it'll regulate later. So, one of the downfalls of all his programs is that they cost the government money. So, is that a sacrifice that we are willing to have? Apparently, FDR says yes. So, here we go. Boom. Take a deep breath. Deep breath in, out. I told you he creates a bunch of programs, and this is not even all of them. I know. He created so many programs. Some of these programs give people jobs. Some of these programs help banks. Some of these programs specifically help farmers. Some of these programs are dealing with homes. Some of these programs are helping workers. Ladies and gentlemen, they call it the alphabet soup because all of these programs got turned into like a acronym, like the CWA, the CCC, the TVA, the HLLC, the NRA, the AAA. They nicknamed it the alphabet soup. The idea here is he's creating so many programs and we can't even keep track and all the little acronyms. You, thankfully, don't need to know much about every program. But what I would love for you to do is I picked 12. Believe it or not, I was cutting it down. I picked 12 and I want you to Google these programs. Google it with the word APUSH next to it though, because if you just type the phrase in there, you'll get a whole essay on it and that's not what you need. You need a one-liner for each one of these programs. You need a quick little brief description. What did it do? Who did it help? Was it successful or not? That's it. So type the words in with APUSH. You can type in New Deal Programs APUSH, APUS History. You might see a Quizlet. You might get Khan Academy. You might get, Albert something or Magoosh. Guys, whatever site you use to get your information, just maybe double check it, especially if it's a Quizlet, double check it with another Quizlet just to make sure that the information's correct because some Quizlets are really good and some Quizlets are not good. So keep your descriptions brief. What did it do? Who did it help? Was it successful? Don't write a whole paragraph for each one of these programs. You do not need that. So love you. Sorry not to overwhelm you at all. But once you get the hang of it, once you find a site, I think Khan Academy had a good little summary of a bunch of these. And so you'll find them, okay? But get them all down in your notes, a quick little one-liner. Okay, you're almost done. I know, you're almost done. How did the New Deal affect everyone? So, as we know in US history, the New Deal does not affect every single person the same. Based on your gender, based on your ethnicity, sometimes you view history different. Sometimes you live in America different. So, let's look first at women. Just big shout out to FDR's wife, Eleanor Roosevelt. She was a huge supporter of women's rights. She was also a huge supporter of civil rights. So I feel like, and more stuff has been released recently that kind of proves that FDR was very much urged by his wife to support women and civil rights. So women were actually given a lot of high government positions during this time. But the one I wanted to just do a quick shout out is this is when we get our first female cabinet member. These are the people that are right next to the president giving advice. So shout out to Frances Perkins, our first female cabinet member. However, in the New Deal, in the Great Depression, there was still a lot of gender discrimination in the workplace. Remember, some of these programs are helping workers, right? Some of these programs are setting a minimum wage. Well, some of these programs are setting a lower minimum wage for women. So it's good that they're setting a minimum wage, but they're just blatantly and openly discriminating people based on their gender. Then some programs are just offered to men. So just completely, very obvious, some of these programs are only helping out men. I mean, some people were really mad that women were even in the workplace during the Great Depression. Because for every woman that was working at a factory, people would be like, oh, a man could be doing her job, and a man could be doing her job better. Yeah, I know how that sounds, but that's what people believed in during the Great Depression. Okay, for African Americans, Eleanor Roosevelt was a huge proponent of civil rights. So there's going to be a lot of good things, but a lot of hard things too. So there was a bunch of African Americans, Black Americans, appointed into government positions, high federal government positions, at least 100. And one of the main leaders, oh my gosh, Mary Bethune, I think is her last name. She was one of the advisors, and she basically created for Roosevelt something called a Black cabinet. So she's a Black American woman, and she wanted FDR to be getting specific advice from the Black community. So just like FDR would turn to his presidential cabinet for advice, in this case, he might turn to the Black cabinet for advice on civil rights. Now, before you start chanting how FDR is the best president in the world, even though he helped Black Americans, and he listened to Black Americans and gave them government authority and power, he didn't do the two things that they wanted. The NAACP has been pushing for two clear changes. They want anti-lynching laws, and they want the voting poll tax to be gone. After asking and asking and asking and demanding and demanding and demanding, FDR did not pass any anti-lynching laws or cancel the voting poll tax. This was a huge blow to many civil rights leaders and the NAACP because it showed that FDR was doing some for the Black community, but not doing the hardest things, you know? Like, okay, cool, we have a senator, but people are still being lynched. So that's the tension there. Some programs, just like for women, are setting lower minimum wage for people of color, and they're just generally favoring whites. Again, there's so much competition for jobs. You guys can imagine that if a company can only hire two more people, they're going to favor white men over people of color or women. Mexican Americans are definitely struggling during the Great Depression. They're experiencing a massive low pay and discrimination in some programs. In fact, the most blatant discrimination that is targeted to Mexican Americans is some of these programs required that you have a permanent residential address. Well, a lot of our Mexican Americans are migrant workers at this time, which means that they move around wherever they can find a job, wherever they can find field work. So they don't have a permanent residential address. And so these programs were clearly trying to discriminate against Mexican Americans and picking something that they knew that they wouldn't have so that they wouldn't receive the benefits from the program. So, okay, you want some positive news? Shocker. Native Americans. I know, right? So, in the hubbub of the Great Depression, in the chaos of the Great Depression, which I have a theory why this happened, but Native Americans actually receive a lot of benefits. So, prior to the right before the Great Depression in 1924, Native Americans had finally received full citizenship by law. It's about time. I mean, we were on this land before you. But Native Americans can now be full citizens. But the big thing that was happening during the Great Depression, during the New Deal, was we were taking a big shift from assimilation to autonomy. Okay, assimilation means you make everyone look the same. You force everyone into the same culture. So if you remember, the last time we talked about Native Americans is they were being forced to assimilate. Anytime that a Native American was pushing back, they were met with violence and they were met with trouble. America wanted Native Americans to be like us, be like quote unquote American culture. They gave them reservation land, but even that was kind of weird. And so the idea here is that the American government was kind of trying to control Native Americans. And now during the New Deal, they're letting Native Americans control themselves, autonomy. So tribal lands were actually returned to tribes. More reservation schools started popping up. Before, they had to send their kids to American boarding schools somewhere else, but now they can be taught on the reservation. And they could be led by their own tribal councils. So they don't have to, like, if they're on their reservation, they don't have to follow all these other American cultural rules. They can have their own tribal councils in their own reservation. Again, giving more power to the Native American tribes. This sounds too good to be true, and one of my theories is that it could be. I think maybe during the New Deal, there were just so many people to try to support and try to help. So maybe they kind of wanted the Native American community to just help themselves. So I don't know. A lot of people liked this, that Native Americans were able to be left alone, but some people did like the support that the government gave them. So kind of two sides to the coin. The very last group of people are workers. So just workers in general, union members, they're actually doing pretty well at this time. It's not like this time is perfect, but during the New Deal is really trying to support workers in the Great Depression. So they are seeing better working conditions. They are being heard. So their business leaders, their company bosses are listening to them more. But there are still strikes happening. Even in the Great Depression, even in the New Deal, there are still people that are fighting for better working conditions. The most popular one happening in the Great Depression are things called the sit-down strike. So it's not just like striking outside of your business, it's actually striking like inside your business. So imagine everybody goes to a factory to work and then they just sit. So that causes a disturbance, and your boss is definitely like angry and maybe will listen to you. Do not try this in the actual classroom if I was your teacher. Don't be like, we're just going to sit and not do anything, blah, blah, blah. Don't do that. Do not learn that from this lesson. Okay, so let's take a breather. I want to know what you think about this question. We're going to talk about this in class when we're together on Zoom, but you've been hearing two stories, maybe two big stories, but a lot of little stories of how the government responded to the Great Depression. So what do you think? Should the government, the federal government, the national government, Should the government play a heavy role when solving an economic crisis? For example, think about the Great Depression. Did you think that it was good that the government stepped in and did so many things? Or do you think that had negative reactions? Look at the COVID pandemic. Do you like how our government has responded? Do you not like how our government has responded? How much should the government play a heavy role? Yeah. So I want to know your thoughts. I don't want to talk anymore on about it, but get your thoughts down in your notes. Should the government play a heavy role when solving an economic crisis? Underneath that answer, we are also going to talk about this political cartoon. This political cartoon. Please answer number 1 and 2 in your notes. What do you observe about this photo? Okay, that's number 1. Number 2, what is the author's point of view on the New Deal? Is the author in support of the New Deal or is the author against the New Deal? Make sure to explain your argument in your notes. Okay? And last but not least, this is a separate assignment, and I'll talk about it in class, but just so that you hear an extra explanation of it. The big thing about AP US history is looking at American history overall, looking at the full timeline of American history and making connections and studying it as a whole. There are 2 time periods that I specifically want you to compare and contrast. The first time period is the Progressive Era, and the second time period is the New Deal era. You can tell that these aren't random, right? Both of these are time periods where there were problems happening, and this is the time period of solutions. What were the problems happening before the Progressive Era? Okay, and the Progressive Era was trying to solve those problems, right? What about the New Deal? What are the problems that the New Deal is trying to solve? Okay, and there's solutions there. So I want you to think about similarities and differences between these 2 time periods. Think about the goals of the time periods, the problems they were trying to solve, the solutions that they had, any information about the federal government, any specific information. You, of course, put the progressive information on the left, the New Deal information on the right, and any similarities in the middle. I want a minimum of 15 details spread out through the Venn diagram. You can also do this in a table if you don't want to do the circles. You can just do a little table with 3 different things. Progressive on the left, similarities in the middle, and New Deal on the right. Make sure there's at least 15 if you want to go above and beyond for extra credit. You definitely can. Make sure you're doing this. Some of you know what I mean. I've noticed randomly that sometimes in a quiz or in a random assignment, when I ask you to give your opinion or you to synthesize information, which is what this is, sometimes I get these weird answers because you looked online and you got weird answers. I know where you looked because I looked too, and they're just weird and they're wrong sometimes. Like, for example, for pros and cons to imperialism, some people kept saying something about crop production for the pro, and then the con was the slave trade. I'm like, bro, wake up. We don't have slaves anymore. So it was strange. So don't Google this question and look for these answers because then you just stopped thinking. I know that when you look at the Progressive Era and when you look at the New Deal, I know you're going to see some similarities. And I know you're going to see some differences. Take your notes, take your ideas from both time periods, and do a Venn diagram and do a table on your own. Don't cheat by looking at the internet because then you're just going to get weird answers. So, with that, that is the end of this lecture. You guys are amazing, beautiful, wonderful people. Thank you for listening.